about this book that Gavin kindly mentioned. I just want to say, in many ways, this book that I just finished, Replenish, would in some ways not exist were it not for Kavira and the sort of light that Kavira's been shining on this partnership we call the Radical Center, and all of the innovative ways that the Kavira community here and at large has been showing how we can build food, water, and economic security while at the same time healing the earth. So I really want to give a nice shout out to you all who are doing this work on the ground, to Kavira, who brings us all together at least once a year to celebrate this and to do this kind of work. I really couldn't have written this book without what I've learned and experienced from engaging with all of you. So thank you very, very much. And I do hope you'll pick up Replenish. I should say, if you do pick up Replenish, and I hope you will see in it many of the people you know from Kavira, people who have spoken here in the past, people who are speaking here at this conference, and people who are here on the stage right now. So I do hope you'll take a look at it, and I'm always looking for feedback, so don't hesitate to get in touch. As we heard so eloquently this morning, it all begins with water. I think of water as the most important asset on this planet to our well-being and to our security. Yet, as we all know very well, the water cycle is badly broken. We have rivers that are no longer reaching the sea, we have depleted groundwater, we have our stormwater in cities causing these enormous floods, we have floodplains disconnected from rivers, so they're no longer doing their work of controlling the floods. The world's soils, many of you work on soil health, the world's soils hold 8 times as much water as all the world's rivers combined. But because of monoculture cropping, deep plowing, and all the things we know in conventional agriculture, that soil reservoir has shrunken. It no longer holds as much water as it did before. The message of Replenish that I've tried to get across, though, is that yes, this water cycle is broken, but one river, one watershed or catchment, as we heard this morning, one river, one catchment, one farm, one ranch at a time, we can begin to fix it. And that's really what so many of us are attempting to do. A few of the examples in this book may resonate with some of the work you're doing. One talks about farmers and conservationists and scientists working together in the Central Valley of California to actively recharge the groundwater that's been so badly depleted in this food and vegetable bowl of the country. Others talk about ranches in Texas and here in New Mexico that are doing the practices of managed grazing to begin to restore soil fertility and the grassland habitat, so critical to birds and wildlife in the West, as well as to sustainable beef production. And it tells how irrigators in the Verde Valley are partnering with conservationists to show how we can return water to this depleted river by installing some not very sophisticated, but new technologies that allow the irrigators to take just the water they need and leave the rest for the river, a solar-powered headgate that allows them to do that. So these are examples of partnerships that allow us to have that food and economic security while at the same time giving something back to the natural world. So these are the stories that I think inspire us, they inspire me, and we're going to hear about another important one today. We're going to talk about one of the most ambitious and pioneering initiatives out there to build resilience against the impacts of wildfire on our drinking water sources, and it's called the Rio Grande Water Fund. I like to think of watersheds as kind of nature's water factories. If you think about what a healthy watershed is doing, it's collecting, storing, treating water as it flows across the landscape. As we begin to develop our watersheds, if we manage forests poorly, if we have too much urban development, if we have inappropriate land uses of some kinds, watersheds can no longer do that important service, and the reliability of that water supply is diminished. And that, of course, has impacts downstream for the water users and the water supplies. So we're now beginning to see this, of course, big time with the rise, with the rise in mega fires, especially here in the West. With higher temperatures and the likelihood of more severe droughts, we can expect more wildfires of greater intensity and greater scale. Here in New Mexico, the two biggest wildfires on record occurred just 11 years apart from one another. The Cerro Grande fire in May of 2000 and the Las Conchas fire in 2011, just 11 years apart, the two biggest fires in New Mexico's history. Now keep this statistic in mind as we talk about this today. About 2/3 of the West's water supply comes from forested land. So building resilience to wildfires so as to protect downstream water supplies is absolutely critical to water security as we move forward. And with more than half of the U.S. Forest Service's budget now going to fight wildfires, there's less public resource available to do the kind of rehabilitation of our watersheds that's needed to mitigate catastrophic fire. So the Rio Grande Water Fund is a homegrown response to these challenges. It connects the whole community to their source of water, the watershed, and it's bringing businesses, water providers, conservationists, and local citizens together to build greater water security and to own this issue. It is, in my mind, the best in water stewardship, and it's stewardship in action. So we have here today a great panel to talk about the Rio Grande Water Fund and to do kind of a deep dive into it that should shed light on this whole nature of partnerships and how we can, in whatever way we're working, use the lessons of this fund to help us do better at what we're all doing. We have a terrific panel. I'm going to keep these introductions a little bit short. Everyone here deserves a longer introduction than I'm going to give them. But please go to the Kavira website and see a little bit more about each of our panelists today. So our first up is going to be Laura McCarthy. And briefly, Laura is the Associate State Director for the Nature Conservancy here in New Mexico. She manages the Conservancy's programs in the Rio Grande, the Gila, and the San Juan basins, and leads the Rio Grande Water Fund. She's been with the Conservancy since 2005, and prior to that worked for more than a decade with the U.S. Forest Service as a firefighter and planner. Laura has earned several awards for her work, including Governor Martinez's Environmental Leader Award in 2015. So Laura's going to kick us off with a presentation on the Rio Grande Water Fund, which will set the stage for the conversation we'll have afterward. I think I will introduce our other two panelists before we go into that, so you know who's sitting on the stage. We have Toner Mitchell, next to Laura. Toner is New Mexico Water and Habitat Program Manager at Trout Unlimited, where he works to achieve conservation outcomes and ecosystem resiliency, guided equally by the objective of spurring economic development in rural communities based on sustainable resource use. Early in his career, Toner served as an environmental advisor to Senator Jeff Bingaman, and today he also leads fly fishing trips right around the West. And on the far right, we have Katherine Yuhas, who is the Water Resources Division Manager at the Albuquerque-Bernalillo Water Utility Authority, where she's in charge of just about everything, from aquifer storage and recovery, to resiliency planning, to water conservation, to source water protection. From 2002 to 2016, Katherine served as the authority's water conservation officer, and during that time, this is very impressive, during that time, water usage per person fell by 38%. I don't think too many of us have a statistic that indicates how well we do our job like that one. But anyway, that's a fantastic bit of success in Katherine's work at the utility. So with that, I'm going to invite Laura up, who'll give us this great background, and then we'll kick off the conversation.
So this is one of the fires that Sandra mentioned, the Las Conchas fire, on the day that it basically exploded from nothing into 43,000 acres burned in 14 hours. This photo is the peak of the blow up that day. And you can see that orange rim about 1,000 feet off the ground, and that's combustion actually taking place up in the plume. Really unprecedented in the scale of fire and the damage that it left behind. This is a kind of high severity fire that is unprecedented, and this all happened in the Jemez Mountains, only about 30 miles from here as the crow flies. And we ended up with 66,000 acres that looked like that. So this map shows the different severity of the fire footprint, with the darkest red being the highest severity. And that photo I showed you, taken where the circle is, we also, well, and I guess also notice the Rio Grande and the Cochiti Lake, because those will figure here in a minute. So we had 2 afternoons of rain that happened to fall about where that yellow circle was drawn. This is the flooding you never want to experience. So here at the end, the camera is turning down toward the Rio Grande. This is one of the buildings that was in the way, and you can kind of imagine here how high the water was. And this is where that canyon, where the photography was taken, video was taken. This is where that canyon joins the Rio Grande itself, and you can see in the lower left all that sediment. That's a sediment plug that the Army Corps of Engineers estimates is 70 feet deep. So just massive movement of debris and material out of the upper watershed into the river itself, which does not bode well for the downstream water users, whether they're municipal or agricultural. This is the reservoir that is only about a mile from the confluence of the canyon with the Rio Grande, taken the very next day, and then water samples, not from the reservoir, from a river, another tributary at a different point during the same fire. But you can see the impact on water quality. And it's kind of a gift that keeps on giving. This photo taken at another tributary location 3 years after the fire. So material just kept coming out of the burned area. So there's the problem. We're not going to dwell on the problem. We're really going to talk about proactive solutions, but sometimes it does take a crisis to generate new ways of problem solving. And at the time that I started working on this in 2011, the management strategies were really pretty clear, well documented in science, most of them really well tested, and they are tree thinning, cutting and removing overgrown brush and trees, stream restoration, managing fire better and differently, and then dealing with the post-fire impacts and mitigating floods. This graphic kind of shows the totality of this, that you have the wildfire driver, but then you also have the factor of snowpack. Snow, at least in the arid Southwest, but I think really throughout the West, it's a true statement that you get more snow at higher elevations, and a lot of the fire issues and a lot of the forests are at middle and higher elevation locations. The overgrown condition of the fire-adapted forest types, particularly ponderosa pine and dry mix conifer, really needs to be thinned. It needs the overgrown brush and trees removed. If we do that, we're going to help ourselves in two different ways. One is that snow will be able to accumulate to greater depths in the thinned and lower elevation forests, not the highest elevation, but the middle elevations. And the trees themselves, if they're not so overcrowded, won't be pulling as much water out of the ground through evapotranspiration. That in turn helps our economy, those of us who use water downstream, fish and wildlife, and good for, and that in turn then helps to change wildfire behavior. I didn't know if that's me. Okay, thank you. It might be also me shaking a lot, moving. So scale of solution is also really important. And with the Rio Grande Water Fund, we gave a lot of thought to what geography we were going to be addressing this issue. And just to give an example, if you have fire that burns 43,000 acres in 14 hours, then you can't be working at a postage stamp scale. You really need to be working across broad landscapes. And that's what led us to the footprint shown here. And then that also led us to do an analysis, really, to identify where are the highest risk forests. And this map shows the highest risk places statewide, and then how we laid the Rio Grande Water Fund boundary over that. The map on the right shows Albuquerque. I'm not sure if you probably can't really read it, but you can see the cross of the red lines, which are the major interstates that if you're not from New Mexico, you may be used to get here. So it's basically Albuquerque to the Colorado-New Mexico border with a little bit over the border into Colorado. And at the time that we started this work, there was really not a whole lot of thinning work going on. And there was not a lot of money for it. As we did the science work to help establish a goal, we realized that what we were going to need to do was increase tenfold over the current pace and scale of restoration. And that helped us set a goal. And 30,000 acres a year of restoration really is going to make a difference in the face of wildfire that burns 40+ thousand acres in a day. But that was going to be super, super expensive. And that's what led us to call this whole endeavor the Rio Grande Water Fund, because if this was going to work, we were going to have to figure out how to raise major amounts of money. To give you an idea of the kinds of work we're talking about, I have two photos here just showing. I mean, you can imagine that fire on the left is just going to climb right up the trees and go into the crowns, but fire burning on the right is going to do exactly what it's supposed to do, which is burn pretty slowly and carefully along the ground. That's the impact we're looking for. And one of our challenges is that this material on the left is really what we need to be removing. And you can see there's a baseball cap there on one of those trees, just for a sense of scale. Like, these are spindly little things, and a lot of them are 80 to 100 years old. They are just totally suppressed. It's not a healthy environment for them either. We also, within the last year, have started doing wetland restoration, and I want to really give a shout out to the Comanche Creek project, which I know has been led by Kivera and has been presented here at this conference many times. And it's really been an inspiration to us, because throughout the whole forested matrix are an entire complex of wetlands and streams. And these are the natural storage places in our watersheds, and most of them they're not functioning the way they could be. So we are now starting to invest Rio Grande Water Fund money in repairing these places in partnership with folks who do what you all do. I think really the reason that Sandra put this as an example in her book is the partnerships. And we organized the Rio Grande Water Fund with a charter that is really a statement of intent. It's not terribly binding. I don't know if you can read any of those logos, but I also know that, of course, everybody on the stage is a partner, but there are several of you sitting in the audience who are directly participating in this effort. And would you just raise your hands for a second? I won't call you all out, but if you see your logo up there, put your hand up, please. Thank you. Because this problem, as I've explained it, is an enormous issue, and the only way to address it is by creating what I call a we solution. In other words, no single agency or entity can do this work by themselves. We need each other, and we need to be organized and working together toward our common goal. And that's how we ended up with 60 signatory organizations. This shows the footprint of the Rio Grande watershed, and you can see that we have a collection of projects that are spread throughout the watershed. The fire footprint is shown there in red, just kind of for contrast. And there are a number of wood-using businesses because there is definitely an economic component and a jobs component to this work. So to kind of wrap up the summary here, I'm just going to share a little bit of what we've accomplished in the 3 years since we launched in 2014. And the real key is that we raised a substantial amount of private sector money for New Mexico anyway, being that we're not a wealthy state. And that has leveraged an unbelievable amount of public sector money from a whole variety of sources, from state agencies, from Forest Service and other federal agencies, and from local governments, including, for example, the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority that, after working on the plan that was mentioned, included in the plan a policy that allowed the water authority to invest in this care and restoration of the places where their water comes from. A 5-year agreement for $1 million, that's really very significant. And in 3 years' time, we're having an impact on the ground, a measurable number of acres that shows up on the map. And then just kind of showing what we did just last year alone. And I'm particularly proud of the jobs part because this 5% increase in forestry jobs came at a time that New Mexico's economy saw an overall loss in jobs. To show the trajectory of growth over the baseline on the far left in the FY12 and then where we're at now. Also interesting to see that in terms of acres thinned, we're at about 18,000 acres this year. So if our goal is to get to 30,000 acres of thinning, we're about 60% of the way there. Also important is the planning numbers. We weren't initially thinking about planning, but the NEPA process is very important for the federal lands, and we're really thrilled to have more than 200,000 acres in the NEPA pipeline, meaning those are the future acres that we will be restoring. Project categories. All right, so we have a big infusion of money right now. We have $2.4 million from the USDA Forest Service that's being matched by the $1 million from the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority, as well as money from the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. So it's about $3.6 million altogether. And we're about to issue an RFP. So I wanted to just put that out there because we would love to have applications for this funding for projects that have not been on our radar before. So I guess I'm kind of using this opportunity to expand the network. And there will be 3 categories. Forest restoration is one, the stream, wetland, and aquatic restoration is another, and then capacity building is a third. And more info about that can be obtained. I actually brought with me a big stack of our current annual report, and there's lots of contact information in there if anybody wants it. So that wraps up the introduction by me.
Laura. That was a fabulous introduction. I don't know if you all have the same sense of awe about this that I have, because in 3 years to get to 60, I'm sorry you guys can't see us very well over there. Can you? Can you see us okay? To get to 60 signatories in such a short amount of time, and these are businesses, NGOs, state, local, federal agencies, pretty much anyone who has anything to do with the watershed is involved. So I just wanted to follow on for a second with this theme of collaboration and partnership, and maybe just ask Laura to start off with a little more, how did you get to that number? I mean, what does it take to, I mean, you have a compelling idea. The Rio Grande fire set the stage for how important this is. But how did you get 60 signatories in such a short time? I mean, how did you succeed with that?
We definitely didn't start out with that as a goal. We thought that maybe 20 organizations would be reasonable. I think there were maybe two factors. One is the way that the attorneys wrote the charter, which is, it's non-binding, so it really makes it possible for organizations that want to sign on. That the fact of the charter itself is not an impediment because it was written to be open. And then I think the second factor is we have an open door collaborative. Anybody who wants to be there is there. And I think that's a mindset, that it's not exclusive. Part of having a we solution is that the door is always open. And I think the fact of all that money that we have to raise in order for this to work means that there's a real advantage to having that kind of open door, because you never know what kind of resources the next person who comes to the table is going to bring.
Yeah. And maybe just to follow on with that, so Katherine, the water utility has contributed $1 million over 5 years. And this is what I find, that's a very significant contribution. And what I find particularly interesting about it is that it's to rehabilitate land that you don't own. This is not land that is owned by the water utility. So how difficult was it to sort of have the water utility participate in this way financially? How are you paying for it? Is it through a rate increase to the customers? And if so, how did it go over with the customers if there's been a communication? So I'm wondering about your partnership in that regard and how you made it work how you and your team made it work from the utilities perspective.
Good, this is working, got it on. Well, first I would tell you that it is a major accomplishment to get engineers at the Water Authority, and that's mostly who's there. There's nothing wrong with engineers are great, but to get engineers talking about environmental services, that was a big shift to make happen at the Water Authority. I came with this idea, and what I was told was, well, that's the forest and that's the Forest Service job. We don't have to do that. And so it did take a lot of talking at a staff level to bring about this recognition that, well, if the Forest Service isn't doing it, we can't just sit here and point the finger at them and say, they ought to. This is our water. We need to do something about that. And as far as the customers go, we went out to the customers and talked about this, and we actually, developed our water resources plan, which is a 100-year plan. We talked about this with the customers, and they actually played a game with Risk about wildfire. And at the end of it, we talked about the Rio Grande Water Fund and our investment and asked whether we should be doing this. And the resounding response from our customers was, you don't already do that? So there's a real awareness here in Albuquerque that we were able to take advantage of about the connection between the land and water. And so we're very lucky that way. In terms of how we're paying for it, it is coming out of the water resources budget, and no, there was no budget increase to pay for it. So I'm sure all of you manage projects like that. So it's the cutting back on some other areas, more efficiencies, things like that, that's allowing us to do it.
It's funny, you're describing that public meeting just brought this back to me, because in the process of doing this plan, this 100-year plan, Katherine and the utility had wonderful, we call them customer conversations around the city to get people involved and engaged in the plan and to understand what it was about. And I remember the one I went to, I was working on the book, and so I wanted to go to one of these meetings, and the Doghead Fire was burning. I mean, in the Manzanos, just east of Albuquerque. And so I literally was driving to I-25, and this fire was just burning in the east. And then I go up to this meeting where exactly this issue is coming up, and I'm sure that didn't inhibit, right? It probably helped, right? It probably helped.
I'm sure that helped our customers recognize the importance, absolutely.
Yeah. So just to continue with this toner, so one of the things I'm curious about from Trout Unlimited's point of view and perspective is to understand, so obviously there's a lot of need, right, throughout New Mexico to conserve habitat for endangered fish, for native trout and other fish. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about, I guess, sort of how the mission of Trout Unlimited dovetails with the mission of the Rio Grande Water Fund. I mean, why are you here, and how do those missions sort of intersect?
I think for us, the choice to join the Water Fund was a very easy one. We would like Game and Fish and Forest Service and every citizen in New Mexico to focus on nothing but the restoration of the Rio Grande cutthroat trout. But that doesn't make any sense. What makes sense is making sure the habitat that they live in is in great shape. Taking a page from the Kavira book, what they've been doing up in the Comanche was a great lesson in I would say preserving habitat, but TU's philosophy is to restore, reconnect, protect, and sustain habitat. You can't do any of that if there's no habitat to do that with. So, you know, I always look at Laura's film and I see cutthroat just floating downstream. Because I think lately we've been trying to focus on soil, water, and grass. And the grass component is very ailing thanks to our overloaded forests. So it was really easy for us.
That's great. Do you want to say anything else about, I think the collaboration is what is so remarkable about this. I mean, just, there are other watershed funds that have a similar goal that you can find across the country, but none of them have this degree of collaboration. I think it is extremely unique, and I have seen the Rio Grande Water Fund is starting to get attention from other parts of the country, I think, as a different model for accomplishing, you know, these goals. If you look at what's going on in Denver, for example, Denver has a direct partnership with the Forest Service to do a similar kind of rehabilitation of the watershed that supplies Denver, but it's really a partnership between Denver Water, the utility, and the U.S. Forest Service. Nothing wrong with that, but this collaborative nature is such a way to connect everybody to the watershed and engage the whole community, and it's really quite remarkable. The other thing that you brought up and you said you're so proud of is the jobs situation. And Toner, I want to read this because you had an interesting way of framing this. So Toner wrote to me in an email, we were discussing the panel, that he feels that the fragmentation of human connectivity is one of the most serious environmental threats that there is. And part of his enthusiasm for the Rio Grande Water Fund is its potential to repair those disconnections. And I just wonder if you can talk a little more about what you mean about that, how you see the fund repairing those disconnections in a way that has maybe broader implications for the good than simply the fire and water security we're talking about.
I guess I would say that the flight of youth and jobs from rural areas in New Mexico is no surprise to anybody. But I think a lot of that has to do with kind of what Katherine was talking about her ratepayers thinking farther upstream, and that includes the jobs that the fund has been able to generate. A lot of the work I'm doing, the reason why we're trying to connect it to an economic outcome is we need to do something with those trees. We need to make ranching sustainable for the long haul. And like I said, TU's philosophy of protecting, restoring, reconnecting, et cetera, or not et cetera, sustaining. The sustain part is, it has been and it always will be, hopefully, on the shoulders of the rural residents. They're the ones with the eyes on the ground. It's ranchers looking at the range, seeing how healthy it is. It's people who can potentially become workers on the forest. And as I know, I'm a fishing guide, and there's money to be made in guiding trips, hunting trips as well, but also rural communities depend heavily on wild meat, including trout meat. So, you know, it's a reconnection that really must happen, and it's slowly happening. Thank you to the Kavira Coalition and to the Rio Grande Water Fund.
Laura, why don't you take that question on too? I mean, the possibilities for economic development and revival that are possible from a broad-based initiative like this seem substantial. And I know that you said, you know, that the jobs increase was an important aspect of what the fund has accomplished so far. And how do you see that? What's the vision, in a sense, for the fund to do that revitalization and to do that sort of economic security piece? What's your vision for that, if I can ask?
Yeah, I actually don't know if I have a vision for it. What I think we're experiencing is an iterative process. So having created the consensus around the need to scale up, having demonstrated that we really can put the partnerships together and raise the money that's needed to get the acres available for work, now we are really facing but who's going to do the work questions. And I think that the institutions that we have in New Mexico to help us with that are really somewhat handicapped. We have economic development department that's not super helpful. We have a forest industry association that is eager but tiny and doesn't have a lot of resources. We have the people in the community, in rural communities, who know how to do the work in the woods. A lot of them are 80 years and older. And so it's complicated. And I think where we're having some really exciting success right now, including a really interesting discussion yesterday in the field around this, is about using the youth corps model, which is really successful in New Mexico and pretty large scale, and creating a next step for people who've been through youth corps type programs, who have an understanding of what it means to do outdoor work, have some basic skills, and help them basically create a network of different kinds of forest thinning. And yesterday's discussion was really more around wetland restoration and management of grazing on public lands. That there's a whole set of opportunities that we can be working on. And your question makes me think I probably should have a vision for it. Maybe we'll tee that up. Maybe people have ideas that you can share with us. This is adaptive management, real adaptive management, as in we do not have all the answers, and we're learning every day.
I was just going to say, maybe my question was poorly framed, because I think you're right not to have a completed vision for this, because and the phrase adaptive management was right there before you said it, because it really is sort of learning as you go, and what opportunities are going to come up as this unfolds and as it develops. So that makes, in some ways, a lot of sense to me. Yeah. I also write at some length in my book about the Albuquerque water plan. Because in part, it's both a very interesting plan, but also because I don't think there's any other city in the West that I know of that has a 100-year plan for its water supply. In other words, Albuquerque already has enough water to supply its residents, including climate change impacts, for the next century. And that is an enormous success. If you think about the fact that, 20 years ago, Albuquerque was worried about running out of water. The USGS had just come out with studies showing that the groundwater was being depleted much faster than they had thought. There was a possibility that Albuquerque was not going to have enough water in the future. And here we are 20 years later, and they have a plan now that basically secures water for the next century. So I wanted to ask Katherine to talk a little more about that. What is it? How did they do that? And that means no more dams, no more diversions, and no more need to buy other people's water rights, right? So we're going to see how, I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you all did that, and also weave in how does the water security that comes from participating in the Rio Grande Water Fund fit into that plan? So I know it's one of your key components.
Thank you for that opportunity to talk about our plan. When I talk about this 100-year plan with people, I try and hit the three most exciting elements. And the first, of course, is that it is a 100-year plan. And we think we're the only utility in the United States that has a plan that goes out years. The second is that we looked at climate change, and not just one climate change scenario. We looked at over 100 different climate change scenarios and what might happen. And we narrowed that down to about 9 different realistic possibilities for what might happen with our water supply in the future. And so we too are really practicing adaptive management, and we're starting off on this path of what we think we're going to need to do. And every 5 years, 10 years, we will be redoing this plan to reconsider what's happening with climate change. And the third really exciting element, I think, of the 100-year plan is that we set a management level in the aquifer below which we will not go, or we don't intend to go. I mean, in severe drought that was unprecedented, we might go below that. But the goal is at the end of 100 years to still have hundreds of feet of water in the aquifer, so that generations way into the future will have multiple options for how they want to supply water for Albuquerque. And so the aquifer is set up with the idea that there is what we're calling the working reserve, and there's this area of water that we're going to use and replenish over time. And then there's an area below that, which we're calling like a drought reserve. And then below that is an area called the safety reserve. And that we were reserving for catastrophic things that we can't even anticipate now. We don't even know what they might be, but that amount of water down there at the emergency level would supply Albuquerque for 100 years, 50 years, depending on how many people are here and how much water they use. But there would be still water there at the very end. So that was our vision, was to create something that would go far, far into the future. And a big portion of what's going to make that work is reuse of our treated wastewater. So already we use some of our treated wastewater to water parks and golf courses on the south side of town. A lot of it goes back into the river. And as we reduce our water use, though, our need to put water back into the river, our impact on the river, will also decrease. So I don't want to get into all the water rights management of it, but into the future, about 5 years from now, we'll actually have excess treated wastewater. And the plan with that treated wastewater is to start recharging the aquifer with it, to increase the amount of irrigation that we're doing on the south side of town, and to eventually drink that. Either through indirect potable reuse, where we'd store it in the aquifer or put it into the river first, or perhaps eventually even through direct potable reuse. We've talked about this with our customers, and it is amazing the amount of acceptance there is around this idea that we live in the desert and we're going to have to eventually drink that wastewater supply. We had around a 70 to 80% acceptance level just in our initial talks with the public, saying, this is what we're talking about doing, would you be comfortable? Or would you be, merely comfortable with some more information? So we're very excited about that opportunity. And I do want to emphasize what Sandra said, which is that we have no plans to purchase additional water rights over the next 100 years, which means no more water coming out of ag in order to supply municipalities here in Albuquerque. I didn't say anything about the Rio Grande Water Fund, did I?
Go ahead.
I just got so excited about the Water 2120. But a piece of this that came out of the climate change portion was our recognition that the watersheds that supply, that work as our natural reservoirs were a really important part of the system, and that we needed to take some action to safeguard those in the face of climate change, in the face of increased wildfire. And so it was just kind of perfect timing that Laura was starting the Rio Grande Water Fund and talking to us. We don't know how to do forest restoration work, but fortunately we can give our money, invest in it, and have experts take care of it. So it was a perfect timing for us.
That's great. I want to also ask maybe all three of you to think about this question with me, because it's something I think we all would think about. This is a very big project. We're out 20 years, 600,000 acres identified to undergo rehabilitation, to build that fire resilience and build water security. I want to talk a little bit about confidence, in this. The science in some areas of this is quite established. In other areas, as you have educated me, is still pretty new. And yet we have to get going and we have to do this. And so from the point of view of you as sort of spearheading the fund with partners, from the point of view of the water utility, from the point of view of a conservation aspect, what confidence level is there in, at the end of 20 years, if the 600,000 acres are rehabilitated, that we will have the water security we're buying into? It's kind of maybe an awkward question, but it's one that I think anyone looking at something this big would say, okay, it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of time, we have 60 partners. Is it really going to work? And I'm just wondering, does it keep you up at night? Does it, how do you feel about this? I'm sure a lot of things probably keep you up at night.
I will say we've had very long staff meetings on this topic. And the variable is climate change. If we knew the climate was going to stay the same, I think we would be very, very confident that fire behavior would be modified as a result of these actions. But the climate is not going to stay the same. And how quickly it changes and whether the impacts are, whether there's variability within the various mountain ranges that are part of the Rio Grande Water Fund or not, those are some of the things that create uncertainty. At a minimum, though, this activity will help facilitate a graceful transition. In other words, we know it's pretty likely that forests in the future in arid state like New Mexico are going to be very different because of changes, because of the higher temperatures and the increased variability in precipitation. It's going to change. At a minimum, though, just creating healthier conditions, more drought tolerance within these middle elevation lands, and in some places like the Jemez high elevation, at a minimum, it's going to make the trees better able to withstand the stress. And that's why the Nature Conservancy is in this. That's, in our hearts. It's not a public message, graceful transition to climate change. That's not the message, especially right now. But to you all, I can say it, and hopefully it resonates a little bit.
I guess I have a different version of the same answer that Laura gave, I think. I don't have a lot of confidence at all that this is going to work. But I have a great deal of confidence that not doing the same thing is definitely not going to work. So I guess there's a message of hope in there somewhere. But I mean, like I said, we have an ecological situation that's untenable and I would argue even that it's untenable without climate change. We have forests threatening to ruin Catherine's 100-year plan. I was born in New Mexico, so I like living here. I like having my son go to school and having water come out of the tap that's really good, high quality. And I love to fish, but the doing nothing that's not at a landscape, human and ecological scale is just not an option anymore. So I don't feel that we can do anything else. I think we need to operate like that. We need to, the forests and streams are very departed from past conditions, and those are the conditions that have been able to sustain us thus far. I don't want to leave on a kind of message of pessimism, but the Rio Grande Water Fund has definitely inspired me to get to work on stuff that we should have been doing yesterday.
Well, I'm just by nature more optimistic, so it's good I get to be the last. I have confidence that the Rio Grande Water Fund is doing the right things and that future partnerships like this will be the other ways in which we address climate change, and that this is a model for how we're going to come together in the future to address all sorts of things that are of concern to water managers and environmentalists and the business community. So that's my more optimistic idea.
And I'm just going to ask one more question following exactly on to that point, but then we're going to open up to all of you. So be thinking about questions you might have for anyone on the panel, anyone and everyone on the panel, while we're doing this last question, and then we'll bring the mics out to you, okay? So Katherine, you gave a nice segue to my last question, which is most of us in this room either are working directly on some collaborative venture or are interested in participating in some collaborative venture. We're going to need more collaborative ventures. The whole idea of the Radical Center is partnering. So I'm wondering what lessons from your experience so far with the fund might you want to impart to others embarking on a similarly collaborative, somewhat visionary venture?
Okay, it's a big question, but I think two kind of things, and they're related to each other in an inverse sort of way. The first is the importance of setting a clear values-based goal that is easily articulated. It really can be a soundbite, but also resonates for people. And the second is about listening, which I think is the foundation of any good collaborative. Anybody who is participating needs to have a voice and needs to feel heard, or else they will drop out. And somehow those two are sort of related to me, because I think the identification of that highest level shared goal is based on listening.
I guess this is kind of repeating myself maybe, but on the collaboration front, this has given us an opportunity to get voices from everywhere, but also really reinforce the idea that we're all in this together. And I work mainly at the high elevations and out on the dirt and grass, so I get the pleasure of engaging with a lot of ranchers and land users, and they have been really important in helping me anyway, and hopefully you, but develop a vision that can actually really protect our water. Well, I mean, they have their hands in the water. They irrigate crops. A lot of the times they're giving me sweet fishing spots, you know. And he is really trying to crack this nut of being able to use the land and make the forest much healthier, with the ultimate recipient being the Jemez River watershed. I don't know if that answers your question, but without partners like that, I don't see how this thing works. Without, like I said, connecting the upstreamers to Catherine's ratepayers, it's been very important as far as I've seen it.
Catherine, do you want to add anything to that, or no? Yes? You sure? Last word time.
Oh, really?
No, you have another chance. So, time for you to get involved. Do we have any questions? We do. Excellent.
I'm going to start in the back and then I'll move forward.
I'm wondering if you can speak to how you utilize, once you get to the point when you cut all the extra wood, what is the plan to utilize that? And specifically asking you because in Australia there is an earth system, a portable biochar pyrolysis machine, what I'm so hoping some days we have here. I think it would be a great utilization to immediately turn it into biochar and put it right back. So if you can speak to the utilization of wood.
Sure, the utilization of wood has been really slow, and the primary use, because it's so small, is firewood. It turns out, of course, that firewood in northern New Mexico is super important, so it really is helping people to have an increased supply of firewood, but it's not our final solution, and it's one of the areas that we're working on and struggling a bit because it's complicated. It's federal land, which has lots of strings attached to how product is removed. The transportation distances are far. It's a challenge, but I mean, I think we'll get there someday, but not a lot to share in terms of success just yet.
Over here on your left side.
You bring out a critical point in terms of looking at landscape level treatment capability. And you're talking about federal lands where Forest Service and the BLM, in this case the Forest Service, is fairly famous for environmental processes to allow or create a decision document that allows that treatment. Even post-fire, Rodeo Chetasky fire burned in 2002. The rodeo fire particularly burned across a big chunk of forest. The tribe was harvesting on the Chetasky side immediately, harvested the wood for 4 years. The Forest Service took 3 years to get an analysis done, and by that time most of the timber that was even accessible was no longer of value. How are you facing or dealing with, or has the Forest Service come forward with a programmatic approach in the watershed that's going to free up or expedite that approval process?
Great question. No programmatic approach. We in New Mexico have to deal with the fact that all of the Forest Service resources for the Southwest region go to the for Fry project in Arizona, and that leaves us with crumbs. That's part of why this homegrown solution. We have been able to successfully create the social license for the different national forests to feel empowered to move ahead with more and more NEPA, and that's why we're seeing the planning increase. I do want to point out, and this is an oversight in terms of how I framed all of this, that there is one major region of the Rio Grande Water Fund that is primarily private lands. And we have the Chama Peak Land Alliance here. Emily, just might as well raise your hand. And they are our very close partner in implementation on private lands. And honestly, that is where most of the native Rio Grande water is coming from. It's off those private lands, and that's why we've dedicated a lot of resources. And thank goodness we don't have to go through the same planning hoops there.
Question here. Good afternoon. I'm Gilbert Yazzie from the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Shiprock. As some of you recall, we had 2 years, this is kind of off the fire situation, but it does deal with a mine spill that took place up in Colorado. The mine spill. But I was wondering if, I think this would be more or less directed to Laura, and maybe if the other two can add into the situation, be good. I was wondering if you've done any work in that situation also. The Kimco mine spill.
Yeah, I actually don't have any experience, but maybe you two do.
All right, thank you.
I think you're referring to the Gold King mine spill. Yeah, I think, I'm not sure what to say about it other than, there's a lot of effort now to understand what the impacts of that spill have been. Obviously cleaning it up is an important spill. For those of you who don't know, this was just upstream of Durango on the Animas River. This was an accidental occurrence. An EPA contractor ended up causing a massive spill of toxic chemicals into the Animas River in the upstream, and it flowed down through native lands and along the Animas into the San Juan, and then on to Lake Powell. So it was a very significant spill. But my understanding is that the effort is to understand what the impacts were, how to clean it up. You may know more about it than I do, but just to inform others about your question. And of course, these leaking mines are all over the West, and they're leaking routinely into our rivers. So it's something we have to be, conscious of more generally.
All right, so I wasn't sure if anybody was going to add. We have a question right here.
Thank you. I'm super impressed with your work. Just kudos to you all for doing this. I have a question which might be answered in your report, but did you hire a facilitator, or what was your process for this? You have a lot of stakeholders, it's a lot of funding, it's a big area of land. Can you talk a little bit about the process and facilitation specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did the facilitation ourselves, and I think that we had a vision of how we wanted the collaboration to go, and earned the place as a trusted facilitator of the process, and so it didn't really make sense to hire somebody outside of us. However, we are finding now, as some of the projects really start to drill down into communities, and I'm thinking in particular of a project with the Rio Fernando de Taos that's happening up in Taos, where there's this really fantastic work going on between that's stitching together the headwater forest work with the revitalization of the acequias that deliver water to agriculture in the valley, with the revitalization of downtown, and that work is being professionally facilitated, and that's turning out to be fantastic because the issues there, the barriers are really tough and personal, and it's really important to have a neutral facilitator in that particular situation.
Couple thoughts regarding the Gold King spill. It came right through Durango. No fish and no insects in the water were affected. And to me, if a trout is not affected, it probably isn't that serious. The other thing, separate subject, I was talking to a logger, a guy that makes his living taking logs off the National Forest. The National Forest is so relaxing their rules that they are enabling him, they're paying him to skid. They cut an area, they paid him to skid some of the logs over there where it was handier for the guys to get the firewood, and enabled him to buy the lumber that was good at a discounted price. And the guy just simply said, with the Trump administration, we're relaxing the rules on the forest. So I was encouraged.
We have one more question. You want to take it easy on yourself?
In your mitigation strategies, I didn't see anything explicitly about soil building, which we know is important for infiltration and retention of water. And so I was wondering, is that implied? And is that something you're working on? And if so, what does that look like on public land and on private land?
Outside of wetlands and wet meadow rehabilitation, I don't think we are thinking about soil, and maybe we should be. I would be interested to learn more.
The way I look at it is, yes, the wetland thing does serve to build soil, but I also would offer that we're hoping that more sunlight reaches the forest floor, we get more photosynthetic surface on the ground, and build soil that way. So for me, it's implicit. That's another reason why I love this work, because it really feeds into good ecological practices.
Let's thank our great panel and thank you for your questions.
All right, everyone. And he is really trying to crack this nut of being able to use the land and make the forest much healthier, with the ultimate recipient being the Jemez River watershed. I don't know if that answers your question, but without partners like that, I don't see how this thing works. Without, like I said, connecting the upstreamers to Catherine's ratepayers, it's been very important as far as I've seen it.
Catherine, do you want to add anything to that, or no? Yes? You sure? Last word time.
Oh, really?
No, you have another chance. So, time for you to get involved. Do we have any questions? We do. Excellent.
I'm going to start in the back and then I'll move forward.
I'm wondering if you can speak to how you utilize, once you get to the point when you cut all the extra wood, what is the plan to utilize that? And specifically asking you because in Australia there is an earth system, a portable biochar pyrolysis machine, what I'm so hoping some days we have here. I think it would be a great utilization to immediately turn it into biochar and put it right back. So if you can speak to the utilization of wood.
Sure, the utilization of wood has been really slow, and the primary use, because it's so small, is firewood. It turns out, of course, that firewood in northern New Mexico is super important, so it really is helping people to have an increased supply of firewood, but it's not our final solution, and it's one of the areas that we're working on and struggling a bit because it's complicated. It's federal land, which has lots of strings attached to how product is removed. The transportation distances are far. It's a challenge, but I mean, I think we'll get there someday, but not a lot to share in terms of success just yet.
Over here on your left side.
You bring out a critical point in terms of looking at landscape level treatment capability. And you're talking about federal lands where Forest Service and the BLM, but in this case the Forest Service, is fairly famous for environmental processes to allow or create a decision document that allows that treatment. Even post-fire, Rodeo Chetiskyi fire burned in 2002. The rodeo fire particularly burned across a big chunk of forest. The tribe was harvesting on the Chetiskyi side immediately, harvested the wood for 4 years. The Forest Service took 3 years to get an analysis done, and by that time most of the timber that was even accessible was no longer of value. How are you facing or dealing with, or has the Forest Service come forward with a programmatic approach in the watershed that's going to free up or expedite that approval process?
Great question. No programmatic approach. We in New Mexico have to deal with the fact that all of the Forest Service resources for the Southwest region go to the 4Fry project in Arizona, and that leaves us with crumbs. That's part of why this homegrown solution. We have been able to successfully create the social license for the different national forests to feel empowered to move ahead with more and more NEPA, and that's why we're seeing the planning increase. I do want to point out, and this is an oversight in terms of how I framed all of this, that there is one major region of the Rio Grande Water Fund that is primarily private lands. And we have the Chama Peak Land Alliance here. Emily, just might as well raise your hand. And they are our very close partner in implementation on private lands. And honestly, that is where most of the native Rio Grande water is coming from. It's off those private lands, and that's why we've dedicated a lot of resources. And thank goodness we don't have to go through the same planning hoops there.
Question here.
Good afternoon. I'm Gilbert Yazzie from the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Shiprock. As some of you recall, we had 2 years, this is kind of off the fire situation, but it does deal with a mine spill that took place up in Colorado. The mine spill. But I was wondering if, I think this would be more or less directed to Laura, and maybe if the other two can add into the situation, be good. I was wondering if you've done any work in that situation also. The King Coal mine spill.
Yeah, I actually don't have any experience, but maybe
Okay.
you two.
All right, thank you.
I think you're referring to the Gold King mine spill. Yeah, I think I'm not sure what to say about it other than, there's a lot of effort now to understand what the impacts of that spill have been. Obviously, cleaning it up is an important spill. For those of you who don't know, this was just north, upstream of Durango on the Animas River. This was an accidental occurrence. An EPA contractor ended up causing a massive spill of toxic chemicals into the Animas River in the upstream, and it flowed down through native lands along the Animas into the San Juan and then onto Lake Powell. So it was a very significant spill. But my understanding is that the effort is to understand what the impacts were, how to clean it up. You may know more about it than I do, but just to inform others about your question. And of course, these leaking mines are all over the West, and they're leaking routinely into our rivers. So it's something we have to be, conscious of more generally.
All right, so I wasn't sure if anybody was going to add. We have a question right here.
Thank you. I'm super impressed with your work. Kudos to you all for doing this. I have a question which might be answered in your report, but did you hire a facilitator, or what was your process for this? You have a lot of stakeholders, it's a lot of funding, it's a big area of land. Can you talk a little bit about the process and facilitation specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did the facilitation ourselves, and I think that we had a vision of how we wanted the collaboration to go, and earned the place as a trusted facilitator of the process, and so it didn't really make sense to hire somebody outside of us. However, we are finding now, as some of the projects really start to drill down into communities, and I'm thinking in particular of a project with the Rio Fernando de Taos that's happening up in Taos, where there's this really fantastic work going on between that's stitching together the headwater forest work with the revitalization of the acequias that deliver water to agriculture in the valley, with the revitalization of downtown. And that work is being professionally facilitated, and that's turning out to be fantastic, because the issues there, the barriers are really tough and personal, and it's really important to have a neutral facilitator in that particular situation.
Couple thoughts regarding the Gold King spill. It came right through Durango. No fish and no insects in the water were affected. And to me, if a trout is not affected, it probably isn't that serious. The other thing, separate subject, I was talking to a logger, a guy that makes his living taking logs off the National Forest. The National Forest is so relaxing their rules that they are enabling him, they're paying him to skid. They cut an area, they paid him to skid some of the logs over there where it was handier for the guys to get the firewood, and enabled him to buy the lumber that was good at a discounted price. And the guy just simply said, with the Trump administration, we're relaxing the rules on the forest. So I was encouraged.
We have one more question. You want to take it easy on your side?
In your mitigation strategies, I didn't see anything explicitly about soil building, which we know is important for infiltration and retention of water. And so I was wondering, is that implied? And is that something you're working on? And if so, what does that look like on public land and on private land?
outside of wetlands and wet meadow rehabilitation, I don't think we are thinking about soil, and maybe we should be. I would be interested to learn more.
The way I look at it is, yes, the wetland thing does serve to build soil, but I also would offer that we're hoping that more sunlight reaches the forest floor. We get more photosynthetic surface on the ground and build soil that way. So for me, it's implicit. That's another reason why I love this work, because it really feeds into good ecological practices.
Let's thank our great panel and thank you for your questions.